At night, everything returns to a more honest scale, where voices shrink, wind grows confident, and monuments stop performing for daylight and begin behaving like tired things that have learned patience through centuries of standing still and listening. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora fits this mood precisely, impressive by reputation, overwhelming by geometry, yet strangely modest once darkness removes the audience and leaves only stone, shadow, and time negotiating quietly with one another. In this lowered volume, the temple stops announcing achievement and starts resembling an absence, a deliberate hollow carved into basalt, where light hesitates, slows, and chooses its steps carefully. The phrase carved from a single rock often sounds like advertisement, but here it behaves differently, less excited, less persuasive, more like a factual shrug offered by history after being asked the same question too many times. It does not attempt to impress or astonish, because its method is not dramatic, only stubborn, replacing addition with subtraction, construction with removal, progress with patience, and spectacle with repetition that accumulates quietly over years that blur together. Stone is taken away day after day using rope, plumb lines, chisels, measurements, and routines so consistent they become invisible, leaving behind form not through creativity alone, but through endurance that refuses to hurry. Tonight, this story is told in a sleep version where numbers drift past without obligation, names loosen their grip, and attention is invited to rest rather than perform. A small mercy for listeners, and perhaps an even greater one for the stone itself. What matters here is rhythm, not measurement. Rhythm shaped by repeated strikes, by footsteps returning to the same places, by days beginning and ending without announcement, and by labor that understands time as material rather than enemy. This is a place where history did not rush to prove itself, where effort stayed quiet, where ambition learned to whisper, and where the result was allowed to emerge slowly, almost accidentally, from persistence that never asked for applause. As the night deepens, Kailasa does not demand belief or admiration, only slowness, inviting the listener to move at the pace of stone, borrow its patience briefly, and let the impossible feel manageable simply by remaining still long enough. In that quiet suspension, sleep arrives naturally, carrying with it the sense that human effort, when repeated patiently enough, can reshape even the most immovable landscapes without ever raising its voice. Ellora as a hillside of accumulated time. Ellora does not announce itself as a single moment in history. It behaves more like a hillside that slowly agreed to be altered, one careful removal at a time, across generations that rarely imagined they were contributing to a unified destination. Long before Kailasa emerges as an idea, Ellora already exists as a surface accustomed to patience. Stone here is not hurried. It is approached, tested, measured, and then gradually persuaded to change shape. The result is not a single statement, but an accumulation of decisions that settled into place over centuries. Seen this way, Ellora resembles less a construction site and more a long conversation between human hands and basalt. Corridors appear where stone once resisted. Columns emerge, not because they were placed there, but because everything around them was taken away. Halls stretch inward, with no concern for symmetry, beyond what the rock itself permits. Figures are revealed slowly, as if they were always waiting just beneath the surface, unconcerned with when someone might finally notice them. Nothing about Ellora suggests urgency. It suggests endurance. Within this extended landscape of subtraction, Kailasa occupies a position that feels both inevitable and slightly unreasonable. While the surrounding caves focus inward, carving rooms, sanctuaries, and passages into the hillside, Kailasa insists on doing something far more demanding. It does not stop at creating interior space. It removes the surrounding mass entirely, isolating itself within a carefully measured void. The result is a structure that appears freestanding while remaining inseparable from the rock that gave it form. It stands surrounded by air, yet never leaves the stone. This decision alone marks Kailasa as a different kind of patience. To hollow inward is already an act of commitment. To hollow everything around a form requires a level of restraint that borders on stubbornness. Each removed layer increases the risk of error. Each day of work commits the next day to the same logic. There is no convenient way to revise the plan once the void begins to take shape. Mistakes cannot be hidden behind additions. They remain exposed, permanently visible. In this sense, Kailasa is not ambitious. It is disciplined to the point of discomfort. The hillside itself becomes an archive of effort. Tool marks fade unevenly. Surfaces change texture where hands returned again and again. Stone removed from one area must be carried away, sorted, discarded, or repurposed elsewhere. The act of subtraction produces its own landscape of debris and labor, one that rarely survives in memory. What remains is the negative space, the absence that defines the form. Kailasa exists because so much no longer does. If history allows for gentle irony, Ellora provides it generously. Humanity, having mastered the art of carving rooms, decides that rooms are not enough. Instead of stopping when shelter and enclosure are achieved, it continues removing stone until a complete building appears where a hill once stood. Not assembled, not stacked, simply uncovered. It is an approach that seems almost contrary to instinct. Most cultures build by adding. Here, meaning is produced by loss. In a late-night telling, this choice feels less heroic and more methodical. One imagines workers arriving each morning to a surface that looks almost identical to the day before. Progress is measured in inches, not in milestones. The plan exists not as a dramatic vision, but as a set of proportions held in memory, rope, and plumb lines. There is no ceremony marking completion of stages. Only the quiet recognition that the stone has moved a little further away from its original shape. Ellora as a whole absorbs this rhythm easily. It does not require any single structure to dominate. Each cave accepts its place within the slope. Some are deep and quiet, others open outward, some remain simple, others grow ornate. Together they form a landscape that resists hierarchy. Kailasa may attract attention, but it does not erase what surrounds it. Instead, it depends on that surrounding context to make sense. Without the quieter caves, Kailasa would feel abrupt. With them, it feels like an extreme point along a very long curve. Time behaves differently in such an environment. There is no clear beginning and end. Work pauses and resumes. Techniques evolve. Hands change. Knowledge passes unevenly. What matters is not continuity of leadership or vision, but continuity of method. Stone is still stone. Gravity still applies. Measurement still matters. The hillside remembers these constants, even when names and dates fade. As subtraction continues, the void around Kailasa deepens. Air enters where rock once held firm. Light begins to behave differently, falling across edges that did not exist before. Shadows stretch and shorten, slowly teaching the structure how it will be seen. This relationship between absence and presence becomes the defining character of the space. The temple is not imposed on the hillside. It is revealed by removing everything that is not the temple. In this sense, Ellora teaches a quiet lesson that does not ask to be learned. Creation does not always require addition. Sometimes it requires endurance in removal. Sometimes meaning appears not when something new is introduced, but when enough has been taken away for form to become unavoidable. Kailasa does not rise from the hillside. It remains surrounded by what is no longer there. There is no need to exaggerate this process into myth to appreciate it. Its power lies in repetition rather than revelation. Day after day, stone yields slightly. The hillside adjusts. Over time, a structure emerges that feels less like an achievement and more like a condition that gradually became visible. Ellora accommodates this outcome without comment. It continues holding its other spaces, its other absences, its other patient cuts into stone. By the time Kailasa stands fully articulated within its void, the hillside has already learned how to accept such change. The temple does not interrupt Ellora. It completes a long conversation about what subtraction can become when practiced without hurry. In the end, the hillside is not diminished by what was removed. It is defined by it, and Kailasa, surrounded by air, yet anchored in stone, becomes the most articulate expression of that definition, resting quietly in the place where centuries decided to keep going rather than stop. Working from the top down. The decision to begin Kailasa from the top and work downward is often presented as a clever technique, but in truth it reads more like a quiet admission of risk. Stone does not offer second chances. Once removed, it does not politely wait nearby in case it is needed again. It leaves permanently. This reality shaped every movement of the project. Working from the top was not dramatic. It was cautious. It was a way of forcing certainty early when uncertainty would still be visible. To carve downward is to commit in advance. The crown of the structure fixes proportion immediately. Width, alignment, and scale are locked before the first courtyard breathes air. Every line below must obey the decisions above. There is no room for improvisation disguised as creativity. The temple is not discovered gradually. It is declared at the beginning and then patiently honored all the way down. This method resembles writing the opening sentence of a long text and agreeing not to change its tone later. The first words choose the rhythm. Everything else must follow. If the opening is careless, the error compounds silently until it becomes unavoidable. By carving the highest point first, the builders forced accountability into the earliest phase, where mistakes would reveal themselves immediately instead of hiding below layers of effort. Morning after morning, workers climbed onto exposed basalt. The surface was uneven and uncooperative. Plumb lines were lowered straight into empty space. Measurements were checked and checked again. Hammers struck stone with modest force, not because the stone required gentleness, but because accuracy demanded restraint. There was no need to hurry. Speed would not make the stone more forgiving. The work did not announce itself. No marker proclaimed that something unprecedented was underway. The gestures were repetitive and small. A strike, a pause, a glance along a line. Dust settling briefly before being brushed away. If a wonder emerged, it did so quietly, concealed inside routine. Anyone watching from a distance would have seen only people returning to the same place each day, doing work that looked stubbornly ordinary. Working from the top also controlled vision. The builders always saw what they had already done. Progress was visible above their heads, not hidden below their feet. This visibility mattered. It prevented illusion. Nothing could be imagined as complete until it truly was. The temple revealed itself in reverse order, its most important decisions already exposed to the sky. There is a subtle irony here. Modern construction often hides its errors inside walls, beneath floors, behind finishes designed to smooth over miscalculation. Kailasa did the opposite. It placed its commitment in full view at the beginning. If something went wrong, there would be no polite way to conceal it. The mountain would remember. This approach demanded a different relationship with time. You cannot rush downward excavation without inviting collapse. Each layer depends on the stability of the one above it. Removing too much, too quickly, would have endangered everything. The builders were not racing toward completion. They were maintaining balance. The rhythm was dictated by caution rather than ambition. In this process, gravity became a collaborator. Stone fell away downward, following the direction of excavation naturally. Debris did not need to be lifted upward. It was guided away from the work site by slope and patience. Even efficiency here was quiet, almost accidental, arising from alignment with physical reality rather than domination over it. The workers did not need to imagine the finished temple in detail every day. That burden would have been exhausting. Instead, they trusted the plan and returned to the same actions. Measurement replaced imagination. Repetition replaced inspiration. The task became survivable because it was broken into days that looked nearly identical. There is something almost comforting about this. The builders did not wake each morning facing the entirety of Kailasa. They faced one section of stone, one line, one surface. The immensity was distributed across time, diluted by routine until it became manageable. Monumentality was achieved not through intensity, but through endurance. Errors, when they occurred, were instructive rather than catastrophic. A line slightly off could still be corrected if caught early. That was the point of starting at the top. The structure taught its makers how to listen. The stone responded immediately to misjudgment. It cracked where pressure was wrong. It resisted where force was careless. Over time, the workers learned to read these responses as clearly as instructions. This method also enforced hierarchy of decisions. Large forms came first, details waited, ornament was postponed until structure had proven itself stable. Nothing decorative could distract from proportion. The temple was forced to earn its complexity. This is not how most stories prefer to be told. We like beginnings that sparkle. Kailasa chose beginnings that measured. There is a mild humor in imagining how unremarkable this must have felt at the time. No ceremony marked the first cut. No celebration followed the completion of the uppermost level. The work simply continued downward, day after day, as if nothing extraordinary were happening. History often exaggerates intention. In reality, much of this labor probably felt indistinguishable from yesterday. The top-down method also ensured continuity across generations. A project of this scale could not belong to one lifetime. By fixing the major decisions early, new workers could join without needing to reinterpret vision. The stone itself carried instruction. Each surface explained what must come next. The mountain became a manual written in absence. Seen this way, Kailasa is less a singular act and more a relay. Knowledge passed through hands rather than documents. Precision was preserved not by theory but by example. The temple taught its makers how to continue it. At night, when the tools rested and the stone cooled, the highest edges would have been the first to catch moonlight. The unfinished lower sections remained in shadow. Progress was visible even in darkness. The work had direction, and direction provided reassurance. There is no need to dramatize this process. Its power lies in its refusal to rush. The top-down method did not guarantee success. It reduced risk by accepting limitation. It acknowledged that stone has memory, and that memory cannot be argued with. When people later marvel at Kailasa, they often imagine a moment of genius. In truth, the genius was procedural. It was the decision to make commitment visible immediately, to let the mountain respond honestly, and to accept that patience was not a virtue, but a requirement. If this story is told late at night, it settles into something calmer. The sound of chisels fades. The slope grows still. What remains is the image of proportion fixed against the sky, waiting patiently for the rest of itself to be uncovered. Working from the top down did not make Kailasa inevitable. It made it possible, and possibility, sustained over many ordinary days, proved sufficient. What one rock actually means? Calling the Kailasa Temple, Monolithic does not suggest perfection achieved without interruption, correction, or human judgment, and it does not imply a single, uninterrupted gesture frozen in time. It means something quieter and far more demanding. The core of the structure was shaped directly from living basalt, not assembled from quarried blocks, not adjusted through stacking or binding, but released slowly from the hillside that contained it. The temple remains inseparable from its geological origin, not symbolically, but physically, materially, and irreversibly. To modern imagination, this idea feels difficult to hold for long. Contemporary creation usually depends on addition. Materials arrive already shaped, components are joined, errors can be replaced. Progress is visible because something new appears where nothing stood before. At Kailasa, progress occurred through absence. Each successful day left less material than the one before. Achievement was measured not by what was built, but by what had been carefully taken away and carried off without ceremony. This reversal unsettles modern intuition, not because ancient builders lacked complexity, but because they operated within a different relationship to time. Entire volumes of stone were removed so that negative space could define structure. Courtyards emerged because everything around them vanished. Pillars appeared because stone beside them no longer existed. Walls stood because the rock that once pressed against them had been patiently eliminated. The form did not arrive. It remained behind. This approach resembles minimalism only in its most literal sense. Matter was reduced until meaning remained, not through elegance or theory, but through endurance. There was no moment when the rock revealed its intention. There were only measurements repeated, lines redrawn, surfaces tested again and again, until proportions settled into stability. The mountain did not surrender quickly. It yielded through familiarity. Basalt is not a forgiving partner. It resists uneven pressure. It fractures when rushed. It dulls tools with indifference. Working it requires restraint rather than force, listening rather than insistence. The builders of Kailasa learned its responses intimately. They understood where it would crack cleanly and where it would refuse. This knowledge did not arrive through inspiration. It accumulated through error quietly absorbed. The phrase "one rock" suggests simplicity, but the reality is layered. The stone contains inconsistencies, veins, shifts in density that demand constant adjustment. Monolithic does not mean uniform, it means continuous. Every decision had consequences extending across the entire mass. A mistake near the top could echo downward for meters. There was no reset, there was only adaptation. In a late-night telling, this process feels almost administrative. Day follows day, dust settles, tools are repaired, lines are checked again. No one announces completion because completion is not yet imaginable. The temple exists only as subtraction in progress, a void growing larger, a shape growing clearer by what disappears. There is quiet irony here. Modern architecture celebrates speed. Kailasa required refusal of speed entirely. Progress depended on stopping often, on looking again, on deciding not to remove too much. In this sense, the builders practiced restraint more than ambition. They advanced by hesitation. What survives is not just form, but evidence of sustained attention. The rock remembers every pause. The surfaces hold traces of decisions made without urgency. The temple stands not as proof of power, but as proof of patience, applied consistently enough to become irreversible. One rock means one commitment, extended across time until the stone itself learned to cooperate. When everything unnecessary was gone, the temple remained, not added, not assembled, simply left behind, waiting quietly for time to slow down enough to notice it. Numbers as measures of patience. Estimates surrounding the Kailasa excavation often circulate with an air of spectacle. Millions of cubic feet of basalt removed, thousands of tons displaced, decades condensed into statistics. Yet in a late-night telling, numbers behave differently. They quiet down, they stop asking for admiration, and begin serving a slower function. They become markers of duration rather than proof of achievement. Each figure gestures not toward scale, but toward time itself, stretched thin and handled repeatedly without ceremony. When a chisel meets stone, nothing dramatic occurs. There is resistance, sound, dust, and then absence. One small portion of rock no longer occupies the place it did moments before. That absence does not announce itself. It simply accumulates. Over the course of a day, the change remains barely visible. Over the course of a year, it becomes structural. Numbers exist to bridge that gap in perception, to remind later observers that what feels sudden in retrospect was once incremental beyond patience. The idea of millions of cubic feet removed is not impressive because of the volume alone. It is impressive because of what that volume implies. Each unit corresponds to a gesture repeated countless times, a hand raised and lowered, a body shifting weight, a pause to clear dust from eyes. The work does not rush forward, it settles into rhythm. Numbers record that rhythm after the fact, translating movement into quantity long after movement has stopped. Years pass without announcement. The stone does not age visibly from one season to the next. The people working it do. Shoulders stiffen, calluses thicken. Younger hands replace older ones without ceremony. The project does not mark these transitions, it absorbs them. Numbers flatten these changes into totals, but beneath each total lies a quiet turnover of bodies and skills, all contributing to the same gradual subtraction. There is something almost misleading about precision in this context. To say millions is to suggest certainty. In reality, these estimates are approximations negotiated by scholars and engineers attempting to reconstruct effort from result. The builders themselves did not count this way. They did not measure progress in cubic feet. They measured it in sections cleared, surfaces refined, lines maintained. Their arithmetic was practical, immediate, and unconcerned with future admiration. In modern life, numbers often function as demands, deadlines, targets, benchmarks. They accelerate behavior. At Kailasa, numbers would have done the opposite had they been visible. If each worker had been required to contemplate the total volume remaining, progress might have stalled under its own weight. Instead, attention remained local. One surface, one corner, one edge brought into alignment. Patience survives best when it is not required to see the entire horizon at once. The gentle irony emerges here without effort. Contemporary language insists that time is scarce, schedules compress, efficiency becomes virtue. The Kailasa builders experienced no surplus of time either. Their days were finite, their bodies limited. What differs is not quantity, but attitude. Time was not something to be saved. It was something to be used steadily without expectation of acceleration. Each strike of the chisel becomes a grain falling through an invisible hourglass. Unlike sand, these grains do not accumulate at the bottom in neat piles. They disappear entirely, carried away, repurposed, forgotten. The hourglass does not empty. It reshapes the world around it. By the time the last grains fall, the container itself has changed form. Numbers also conceal boredom, which is an essential component of patience. There must have been days indistinguishable from one another. Days when progress felt imaginary. Days when nothing appeared improved except the familiarity of the task. These days do not survive in records. They are compressed into totals that imply momentum, yet boredom is the medium through which endurance operates. Without it, no large undertaking remains stable. At night, when the site rests and tools fall silent, the numbers lose even more authority. The stone does not know how much has been removed. It only knows its current shape. The workers do not carry totals into sleep. They carry fatigue. They carry memory of motion. Tomorrow will require the same gestures, regardless of yesterday's cumulative success. When historians later convert absence into measurement, they perform a necessary but incomplete act. Numbers allow understanding to travel across centuries. They help modern minds accept duration that cannot be directly experienced. Yet they also risk distorting the texture of labor. They replace repetition with summary. They exchange patience for proof. In the context of Kailasa, numbers are best treated as quiet witnesses rather than protagonists. They stand at the edge of the story, indicating scale without demanding reaction. They remind us that what appears impossible in outcome was tolerable in process, because it unfolded slowly enough to be lived. The stone once whole did not resist its reduction with drama. It yielded incrementally, time behaved similarly. It did not announce milestones. It passed, Workers aged within it, skills transferred across it. The temple emerged not because time was conquered, but because it was accepted as the primary material. In the end, the millions matter less than the patience they imply. The figures are footprints left by time moving through human hands. They point backward toward days filled with modest effort and forward toward a structure that now appears fixed. Between those points lies the true substance of the work, not measurable in volume but in endurance, repeated until form quietly appeared. Space, courtyards, and the feeling of a stone city. Kailasa does not reveal itself all at once. It unfolds slowly, layer after layer, as though the space were practicing patience alongside the visitor. There is no single threshold that announces arrival. Instead, movement through the complex feels gradual, like walking into a town that has been hollowed from stone rather than built upon it. Courtyards open without fanfare, leading to raised structures that seem to rise naturally from the ground, as if elevation were an agreement between gravity and intention, rather than an act of force. The experience is not one of entering a monument, but of navigating a small city whose streets, walls, and plazas were shaped by removal instead of addition, by absence carefully measured rather than matter aggressively piled. The courtyards are the first lesson. They do not overwhelm with scale, nor do they compress the body into reverence. They provide space to pause, to adjust, to notice how light behaves when it is allowed to move freely. Stone walls surround these open areas, but they do not imprison them. Instead, they frame air. The courtyards feel like breaths taken between more concentrated moments, intervals where the body recalibrates before continuing. This pacing is deliberate. The space does not hurry the visitor, and it does not reward speed. It allows wandering without instruction, trusting proportion to guide movement more effectively than signage or ceremony ever could. As one moves deeper, carved walls begin to assert themselves. Reliefs cover surfaces, but they do not attempt to disguise the stone beneath them. The carvings soften edges without pretending to be soft. Figures emerge, details accumulate, yet the weight of the material is never denied. Stone remains stone. It does not mimic flesh or fabric. It accepts gravity openly, and in doing so, it keeps the viewer grounded. The decoration does not seduce the eye into forgetting mass or pressure. Instead, it reminds the body that everything here is held in place by balance rather than illusion. This honesty gives the space its peculiar calm. There is ornament, but no excess. There is complexity, but no chaos. The carvings do not shout for attention. They wait. One can pass them without reading every detail and feel no sense of loss. They are present without being demanding. This restraint feels intentional, almost considerate, as though the space understands that attention is finite and should not be exhausted too quickly. In late-night history, this kind of consideration feels rare and quietly generous. Sound behaves carefully within the courtyards. Footsteps echo, but only briefly. The stone reflects noise just long enough to acknowledge it, then lets it fade. Voices do not carry far. Wind moves through the open spaces without resistance, crossing the courtyards as if they were natural clearings rather than engineered voids. Nothing here amplifies sound for drama. There is no acoustic performance. The space seems designed to return noise to silence efficiently, as though conversation were allowed, but not encouraged to linger. Because of this, movement becomes more noticeable than speech. The act of walking registers more clearly than the act of talking. One becomes aware of the body passing through space, of the relationship between step and surface, shadow and wall. The architecture encourages this awareness gently without instruction. It does not ask for attention, it simply makes distraction difficult. In doing so, it shifts the visitor into a slower register of perception, where small changes matter, and nothing needs to escalate to remain engaging. Despite the density of carving and structure, the complex never feels crowded. Space is distributed generously, even lavishly, but without extravagance. The courtyards provide visual relief, preventing the eye from becoming overwhelmed by detail. Raised structures emerge as focal points, but they do not dominate. They participate in the rhythm rather than breaking it. This balance creates the impression of a city rather than a shrine, a place designed for circulation rather than for a single moment of awe. In this sense, Kailasa feels inhabited even when empty, not by people but by movement itself. Paths feel intentional, transitions make sense. One space prepares the body for the next, without explanation. The experience resembles walking through an urban environment where orientation comes from familiarity rather than signage. You know where to go because the space behaves predictably. Corners turn when expected. Openings appear when needed. Nothing surprises aggressively. Everything unfolds at a pace that feels reasonable, even generous. Late afternoon is when this quality becomes most apparent. As the sun lowers, shadows lengthen across the courtyards, stretching geometry into visibility. Lines that felt static at midday begin to move. Reliefs deepen as light skims their surfaces, revealing depth without theatrics. The space becomes quieter, not because sound disappears, but because attention narrows. Geometry becomes audible in a metaphorical sense. Proportions announce themselves without words. One begins to feel the architecture rather than analyze it. This is not a space that requires ceremony to function. It does not need processions, chants, or declarations. Its rhythm emerges from proportion alone. The distances between walls, the height of platforms, the width of passages all work together to create a tempo that the body recognizes instinctively. You slow down where slowing down makes sense. You pause where pausing feels natural. The architecture does not instruct, it suggests. And suggestion, in this context, proves far more effective than command. There is a faint irony in how composed this feels, given the effort required to create it. Entire volumes of stone were removed to shape these courtyards and structures, yet the result feels effortless. The labor has been absorbed so completely that it no longer announces itself. What remains is not evidence of struggle, but of resolution. The space feels finished in a way that does not demand admiration. It simply works. The feeling of a stone city comes not from scale alone, but from the way spaces relate to one another. Courtyards act like public squares. Raised platforms resemble civic buildings. Passages function as streets. Even without inhabitants, the layout implies social movement. One can imagine people passing through without needing to imagine rituals or hierarchies. The architecture supports ordinary motion. It accommodates walking, stopping, looking, and continuing. This ordinariness is what makes the space feel alive, despite its stillness. In late-night telling, this quality is unsettling in a gentle way. We expect monuments to perform. We expect them to explain themselves, to announce importance. Kailasa does neither. It behaves like a city that does not care whether it is visited. Its spaces remain proportioned for movement, not for spectacle. This indifference to attention creates a calm that can feel almost disorienting. There is nothing to conquer here, nothing to decode urgently, only space doing what it was shaped to do. The courtyards in particular embody this attitude. They are empty without feeling vacant. They hold light without trying to display it. They accept weather, footsteps, and time without adjustment. In doing so, they become places where nothing needs to happen for the space to feel complete. This is a difficult concept for modern environments, which often require constant activity to justify their existence. Kailasa suggests the opposite. Space can be sufficient on its own. As evening approaches, the stone cools, shadows soften, the geometry remains, but it no longer insists on being noticed. The city shaped from absence settles into itself. Movement slows. Sound fades quickly. Wind continues to cross the courtyards, indifferent to history or interpretation. The space does not close. It simply continues to exist, waiting without expectation. In this way, Kailasa offers a lesson that arrives quietly. Space does not need to be filled to be meaningful. Courtyards do not need crowds to function. Architecture does not need ceremony to matter. Proportion, restraint, and patience can produce environments that feel complete without explanation. The stone city remains not because it demands attention, but because it does not require it. And as night deepens, that refusal to perform becomes the most enduring impression of all. Hands without names. History prefers names because names give shape to memory. Dynasties are easier to remember than schedules. Rulers are easier to summarize than work. For Kailasa, historical records often gesture toward the Rashtrakuta period and the reign associated with its excavation in the 8th century. This provides a frame, a timestamp, a convenient label. It explains when the stone began to change shape, but it does not explain how that change was sustained or by whom. Across the long, repetitive stretch of days required to remove a mountain patiently. The hands that shaped Kailasa remain unnamed, and this absence is not accidental. It reflects the nature of the work itself. Individual identity mattered less than continuity. Skill expressed itself through repetition rather than recognition. The people involved appear not as characters but as motion, measuring distances again, checking alignment, striking stone with enough force to fracture but not enough to shatter intention, clearing debris that immediately made space for the next action. Progress did not arrive in dramatic leaps. It accumulated quietly through thousands of similar gestures. In a late-night telling, these workers do not appear heroic. They do not pose against the stone. They arrive early, step into familiar positions, and begin. Tools are lifted and lowered with practiced ease. The sound of chisels remains modest, consistent, almost careful. Stone dust gathers, then is brushed away, revealing surfaces that are slightly smoother than they were the day before. No one pauses to admire this difference. It is noticed only to confirm that the work is moving in the correct direction. Labor here is organized around profession rather than personality. One person measures and remeasures, ensuring that lines remain obedient to decisions made far above. Another strikes at angles learned through experience rather than instruction. Someone else clears rubble, a task that produces no visible beauty, but without which no beauty could appear. Others wash dust from newly exposed surfaces, not for presentation, but so the next cut can be placed accurately. Each role depends on the others without ceremony. There is a quiet irony in how modern imagination seeks individual genius in places built by collective endurance. Kailasa resists this desire gently but firmly. It offers no signatures, no carved acknowledgments, no stories preserved about singular moments of brilliance. The work continues because it must, not because it is celebrated. Skill is expressed through reliability. A hand that strikes correctly every day matters more than a hand that strikes memorably once. As years pass, the workforce changes without interrupting the rhythm. Younger hands replace older ones. Knowledge transfers through observation rather than documentation. Techniques persist, not because they are written down, but because they work. The stone becomes a teacher. It responds differently to pressure, angle, and timing. Workers learn its preferences slowly. This learning embeds itself in muscle memory rather than language. Rest exists, but it is practical rather than restorative. A brief pause in shade. Water shared. Hands inspected for cracks and swelling. Then the same tools are lifted again. Fatigue does not end the work, it is absorbed into it. The schedule adjusts slightly but never stops. Time here is not measured by milestones. It is measured by surfaces completed and debris removed. At night, when the hillside cools and the sound of work fades, nothing about the day announces itself as historic. There are no speeches marking progress, no declarations of purpose. The mountain remains large, the void remains incomplete. Tomorrow will look much like today. This predictability is not discouraging. It is stabilizing. The work does not demand belief in its outcome. It requires only return. The absence of names does not erase contribution. It reframes it. These hands shaped Kailasa not by standing out, but by staying. They returned through seasons, through changes in leadership, through personal aging. Their labor was not designed to be remembered individually. It was designed to be sufficient collectively. This sufficiency is what survives. In the finished form, the stone does not reveal the people who shaped it. It reveals the discipline they shared. Lines remain straight because someone cared enough to check them repeatedly. Surfaces hold because someone stopped at the right moment. Voids feel intentional because removal followed plan rather than impulse. The temple exists not as a monument to individuals, but as evidence of sustained cooperation. History often celebrates authorship. Kailasa offers something quieter. It demonstrates that endurance can produce form without identity, that work can accumulate meaning without narrative, that hands without names can leave behind something precise, heavy, and remarkably patient. When viewed this way, the absence of individual recognition is not a loss. It is a condition of the achievement itself. As the night deepens, it becomes easier to imagine these workers not as figures frozen in time, but as motion that never fully stopped. Measuring, striking, clearing, washing, resting, returning. The rhythm persists even when the sound is gone, and perhaps that is the most honest legacy they leave behind. Not a list of names, but a structure that stands because many people did the same small things well for longer than anyone thought reasonable, and then went home without asking history to remember them loudly. Basalt, light, and controlled obedience. Kailasa emerges from Deccan basalt with the patience of something that was never in a hurry to be understood. Basalt is not a forgiving stone. It does not reward impulsive strikes or careless planning. It resists quietly and consistently, shaping the behavior of those who work it long before it yields to their intentions. This resistance is not dramatic. It is instructional. It teaches restraint through consequence, asking for precision rather than enthusiasm, repetition rather than force. The choice of basalt determined everything that followed. Method, rhythm, and scale were not aesthetic decisions, but responses to material reality. Basalt fractures differently than softer stone. It demands attention to grain, pressure, and sequence. A careless cut cannot be undone. A rushed decision echoes forward through the structure. Over time, this creates a discipline that looks almost like obedience, though it is better described as negotiation. The stone does not obey commands. It responds to consistency. Kailasa was not assembled. It was revealed through subtraction, shaped downward from a single mass. This process removes the option of revision. Once stone is gone, it stays gone. The builders could not adjust later. They had to commit early and proceed carefully. Basalt enforced a kind of honesty. Every decision remained visible. Every error would have been permanent. The absence of visible correction speaks less to perfection than to caution exercised repeatedly. Weather arrived later, as it always does, and continued the work in its own slower register. Wind softened corners without asking permission. Rain traced shallow paths across carved surfaces, not to erase them, but to smooth them. Lichen settled where moisture lingered, neither destructive nor preservative, simply present. Dust gathered in crevices and recessed lines, participating quietly in the long process of change. Preservation and erosion became indistinguishable partners. Light became the primary narrator once the tools were set down. Morning light approaches with generosity. It spreads evenly, forgiving minor irregularities, flattening the stone into calm surfaces that feel approachable and stable. Details soften under this light, not because they vanish, but because they are not emphasized. Everything appears equally important, which is another way of saying nothing demands attention. At midday, light becomes blunt. It strips depth from reliefs and compresses shadow into narrow lines that cling reluctantly to edges. The stone looks simpler at this hour, more architectural than sculptural. This is when modern viewers often struggle. Without dramatic contrast, the eye searches for spectacle and finds none. Basalt refuses to perform. It waits. Evening returns dimension. As the sun lowers, shadows lengthen and details reassert themselves slowly. Carved forms regain their weight. Recesses deepen, surfaces become layered again. This is not revelation, it is restoration. The stone has not changed. Only the conditions have. And under those conditions, complexity re-emerges without effort. Night completes the cycle by removing hierarchy entirely. Artificial light fragments the space. Depth becomes selective. Some surfaces glow briefly while others disappear. The monument no longer explains itself. Navigation becomes tentative. Orientation shifts from visual to bodily. Steps slow. Voices lower. The stone does not guide. It accommodates. There is a subtle humor in this daily performance. The monument appears to cooperate only when conditions align. It offers beauty selectively, almost stubbornly, as if reminding observers that appreciation requires timing. Arrive at the wrong hour and the experience feels underwhelming. Arrive later and the same stone feels profound. The stone does not adjust. The viewer does. This controlled obedience extends beyond light. Basalt's durability creates the illusion of permanence, yet it is constantly changing. Microscopic fractures expand and settle. Surface textures evolve. What appears stable is only slow. The stone does not resist time. It participates in it at a pace that makes urgency feel inappropriate. Kailasa does not dramatize its survival. It has endured not because it was protected aggressively, but because it was allowed to exist without interference. No coatings sealed it. No modern materials attempted to improve it. The basalt remained exposed, confident that endurance did not require intervention. This confidence feels unsettling to modern sensibilities accustomed to maintenance schedules and preservation plans. The lesson here is understated to the point of discomfort. Beauty depends on conditions. Change the conditions and the object becomes something else without complaint. The stone does not mourn lost sharpness or softened edges. It does not argue with lichen or dust. It accepts participation from everything that touches it. This acceptance challenges narratives that frame monuments as frozen achievements. Kailasa is not frozen, it is ongoing. Its meaning shifts with light, weather, and attention. The basalt anchors the structure, but interpretation drifts. Each visit is shaped by conditions rather than intention. In a late-night telling, this matters. There is no climax, no singular moment when understanding arrives. The experience unfolds slowly or not at all. The stone offers nothing on demand. It responds only to patience, and even then, modestly. The controlled obedience of basalt teaches restraint. It reminds us that not all mastery looks assertive. Sometimes it looks like careful listening extended over decades. The builders did not dominate the stone. They aligned with it. And in doing so, they produced something that does not insist on being admired. As hours pass, light continues its circuit. The monument remains. It does not hurry. It does not signal importance. It simply occupies space, responding to conditions as they change, becoming something slightly different without ever becoming something else entirely. In this quiet continuity, the stone offers a final lesson. Control does not always mean force. Obedience does not always mean submission. Sometimes both describe a relationship built on mutual limits, where change is allowed, patience is required, and nothing feels obligated to impress. Kailasa rests in basalt, light passing over it endlessly, weather continuing its work without instruction. And in that ongoing conversation between stone and conditions, meaning remains fluid, unclaimed, and available only to those willing to slow down long enough to notice it. Legends and the shortcut of memory. Legends arrived late to Kailasa, long after the stone had finished its work. They came not from the builders, but from listeners who encountered the monument after its making had faded into silence. These stories did not ask how long the work took. They asked how quickly it could be explained. Memory, after all, prefers efficiency. It trims duration, it compresses effort, it replaces process with moments, and patience with decisions that feel dramatic enough to remember. Later retellings often describe Kailasa as the result of a vow, a challenge, a command issued suddenly, and fulfilled with impossible speed. Kings promise completion within days. Architects act overnight. Stone obeys urgency. These stories move quickly because memory likes motion. A legend that unfolds slowly risks being forgotten. One that concludes abruptly feels complete, even if it misrepresents everything that actually happened. The humor here is restrained, but persistent. Myths treat basalt as if it were cooperative clay, eager to impress an audience. Rock, meanwhile, continues at its own pace, unaffected by narrative deadlines. It fractures when struck improperly. It resists haste. It records every careless decision permanently. Stone does not acknowledge promises. It acknowledges pressure, angle, and repetition. Legends simplify because complexity is difficult to carry forward intact. A process spanning decades cannot be remembered easily without losing shape. Names fade, sequences blur. What remains is structure without labor. The monument stands. The story shrinks. Memory takes a shortcut, not out of malice, but out of convenience. This shortcut reveals something important about how human memory functions. We are not archivists by nature. We are editors. We select what fits comfortably into recall and discard what demands sustained attention. Long effort becomes a single act. Gradual change becomes a turning point. Kailasa, shaped downward through years of controlled subtraction, becomes a sudden achievement because that version travels better. Stone never cooperates with this process. It refuses compression. It does not speed up when spoken about urgently. It retains marks of labor, regardless of how stories frame it. Every surface records sequence. Every layer implies time. The monument does not care whether its story is told accurately. It continues existing as evidence that shortcuts misrepresent reality. In late-night history, this tension matters. The listener is not being asked to choose between myth and fact aggressively. Instead, the contrast is allowed to settle gently. Legends promise immediacy. Stone demonstrates duration. Memory wants closure. Basalt insists on continuity. The legends surrounding Kailasa are not malicious fabrications, they are adaptations. They emerge from the discomfort people feel when confronted with scale that defies ordinary explanation. Faced with work that required years of steady coordination, the mind seeks relief. A vow, a miracle, a single will imposing order. These explanations restore emotional balance by removing the burden of imagining sustained effort. There is mild irony in how these legends frame efficiency as virtue. Speed becomes proof of greatness. Slowness feels inadequate. Yet the monument itself contradicts this value system entirely. Nothing about Kailasa suggests urgency. Its proportions, surfaces, and internal logic all imply patience. The stone was approached cautiously, not conquered quickly. Memory, however, prefers to align achievement with decisiveness. It is easier to remember a command than a routine. It is easier to recall a deadline than a schedule. Legends replace coordination with authority, because authority compresses explanation. One decision feels simpler than thousands of careful actions. The builders left no legend behind. They left surfaces. The myths arrived later, layered onto the stone like a narrative patina that can be brushed away without damaging what lies beneath. When examined closely, the monument resists its own mythology. Tool marks remain. Sequence remains. The slow logic of removal remains visible to anyone willing to look without hurry. Stone teaches a different relationship to memory. It does not preserve intention. It preserves action. It does not record why something was done, only how it was done. Legends, by contrast, preserve motivation while obscuring method. Together they reveal the gap between what is remembered and what is required. This gap is not unique to Kailasa. Across civilizations, monumental labor is often explained retroactively through mythic acceleration. Walls rise overnight. Cities appear fully formed. Effort disappears. Time collapses. These stories function as cultural compression algorithms, making vast projects portable across generations. Late-night listening allows this pattern to feel less accusatory and more observational. Memory is not wrong for taking shortcuts. It is simply doing what it does best. Stone is not offended by misrepresentation. It continues regardless. The two coexist without conflict, each operating under different rules. There is gentle humor in how confidently legends assign timelines. A few days, a single night, a moment of divine inspiration. Meanwhile, the basalt sits quietly, holding evidence of years that refuse to fit into those claims. The contrast does not require correction. It reveals itself naturally. Legends want to be retold. Stone wants to be left alone. Memory circulates stories efficiently. Basalt absorbs weather slowly. One accelerates, the other endures. Neither feels compelled to align with the other. As the night deepens, this realization softens. The listener does not need to reject legend harshly. Legends are part of how humans cope with scale. They make the past manageable. They provide emotional entry points. The problem arises only when legends are mistaken for explanation rather than accommodation. Kailasa does not require explanation to exist. It stands whether its story is told accurately or not. The monument is indifferent to interpretation. It does not argue with memory. It allows myths to orbit it harmlessly, never touching the stone itself. In this calm framing, legends become less threatening. They are not deceptions to be exposed, but reflections of human limitation. Memory prefers speed because speed feels safe. Slowness requires attention. Attention demands effort. Legends reduce effort. Stone never does. It requires sustained presence. It demands patience without offering shortcuts. It teaches by refusing to accommodate haste. In doing so, it reveals the difference between remembering something and understanding it. As with all sleep version history, there is no need for resolution. The legend and the stone can remain side by side. One tells the story quickly, the other tells nothing at all. And in that silence, preserves everything that actually matters. The humor lingers quietly. Myths promise completion on schedule. Rock ignores schedules entirely. Memory edits. Basalt records. One compresses, the other expands across time. And as listening slows, the shortcut of memory becomes easier to recognize without judgment. It is simply one way humans cope with scale. Stone offers another way. It waits, it continues, it remains. Kailasa rests where legends pass over it lightly, never altering its form. Time continues working on the surface. Stories continue circulating. Neither interferes with the other. And in that coexistence, the monument teaches its most understated lesson of all. Speed belongs to memory. Duration belongs to stone. Kailasa in the present. Kailasa exists today in a condition its builders never planned for and never needed to imagine. It receives visitors in numbers that would have felt abstract, perhaps even unnecessary, to those who shaped it. Feet move across surfaces carved for slower passage. Voices rise in spaces once governed by acoustics rather than volume. The monument remains physically unchanged, yet the rhythm surrounding it has shifted in ways that are subtle, cumulative, and quietly consequential. The stone itself does not react dramatically. Basalt is patient. It absorbs contact without complaint. But patience should not be mistaken for indifference. Repetition leaves marks. Foot traffic polishes edges that were meant to remain textured. Hands follow familiar paths along walls, repeating gestures until the surface remembers them. These changes are not sudden. They arrive the way erosion always does, one touch at a time, without urgency. Modern visitation introduces a different tempo. Movement accelerates. Attention fragments. People arrive carrying expectations shaped elsewhere by images, summaries, and schedules. The monument becomes a destination rather than a presence. Time is allocated rather than inhabited. This shift does not damage the stone immediately, but it alters the atmosphere in ways that feel perceptible, even when no single action appears harmful. Sound is one of the first things to change. Kailasa was carved to regulate itself acoustically. Stone corridors absorb and redirect noise naturally. Quiet once arrived without instruction. Today, sound enters persistently. Conversations overlap, echoes multiply, the space adjusts, as it always has, but the balance tilts. Silence becomes something that must be searched for, rather than something that happens on its own. There is gentle irony here. Visitors often arrive seeking connection with the past, yet bring with them habits that shorten attention spans and compress experience. Photos replace observation. Commentary replaces listening. The monument does not resist this behavior. It accommodates it without endorsement. Stone has learned over centuries that resistance is unnecessary. It allows patterns to pass over it, knowing most will be temporary. Daytime amplifies this effect. Light reveals crowds as clearly as carvings. The structure appears busy, active, almost conversational. The monument becomes part of a system designed for circulation rather than contemplation. Paths are followed quickly, pauses feel awkward, time moves forward insistently, guided by opening hours and exit points. Then evening arrives as it always has, and the dynamic shifts again. Gates close, movement slows to nothing. The site regains a form of equilibrium that feels immediate, almost relieved. Stone cools gradually as heat dissipates. Dust settles back into recesses. Shadows return to corners without being displaced by motion. The monument does not celebrate this return to quiet. It simply resumes its default state. Night restores hierarchy differently. Without human presence, light becomes selective again. Surfaces emerge and disappear depending on angle and source. The structure feels less like a destination and more like a condition. Nothing performs. Nothing explains. The stone is not interpreted. It is allowed to be. This nightly transition carries a quiet lesson. Kailasa does not depend on modern attention for relevance. It existed long before being labeled a heritage site. It endured centuries of neglect, weather, and changing priorities without complaint. The current period of intense visitation is brief in comparison, even if it feels dominant now. Ancient structures were not designed for constant interpretation. They were built to function, to exist, to shape space and experience naturally. Meaning emerged through use, not commentary. Modern engagement often reverses this relationship. Interpretation arrives first. Experience follows second, if at all. There is mild humor in how confidently modern systems assume authority over ancient space. Signage explains what the stone never tried to explain. Pathways suggest where attention should go. Rules attempt to manage behavior in an environment that once managed itself through proportion and material. These efforts are not malicious, they are well-intentioned. They are also unnecessary from the stone's perspective. Kailasa does not demand restraint verbally. It does not enforce silence. It does not correct misunderstanding. It simply continues existing under whatever conditions are imposed. This neutrality can feel unsettling. We are accustomed to feedback. The stone offers none. Restraint, when it appears, comes from the visitor rather than the monument. Those who slow their movement notice shifts others miss. Sound softens when voices lower. Detail returns when attention narrows. The space responds immediately to behavior, not instruction. This responsiveness has always been present. It requires participation to be felt. History survived long before modern attention learned how to cue. Kailasa endured periods of abandonment when no one visited at all. It endured repurposing, neglect, and partial forgetting. The current challenge is not survival in the face of absence, but endurance amid abundance. The monument does not resent being visited. That would imply expectation. It does not feel honored either. It does not need affirmation. It remains what it is, regardless of how it is framed. The stone neither benefits from admiration nor suffers from misunderstanding. In the late night telling, this balance becomes clearer. Without crowds, the structure feels less like an object and more like an environment. The absence of interpretation is not a loss. It is a relief. The stone does not need to be translated to be experienced. It needs only space and time. Modern presence will continue. This is not a critique of visitation itself, but a reminder of proportion. The monument has existed across many rhythms. The current one will pass, as all rhythms do. What remains constant is the stone's capacity to absorb change without becoming defined by it. As hours pass, the site rests, night deepens, temperature equalizes. The basalt holds its form quietly. Whatever impressions were left during the day settle into a long continuum of contact and release. In this stillness, Kailasa returns to something closer to its original condition. Not physically, but relationally. It is no longer being used as a backdrop or reference point. It is simply present. The lesson offered here is understated. Ancient structures do not ask to be explained. They ask to be approached carefully. They reward restraint not by revealing secrets, but by maintaining balance. History did not require constant attention to survive. It required only that no one hurry it unnecessarily. Kailasa, in the present, remains unchanged in its expectations. It does not adjust itself for modern schedules. It does not accelerate meaning. It waits, as it always has, confident that time will continue working long after current patterns fade. And as the night settles fully, the monument rests again in silence, undisturbed by interpretation, uninterested in commentary, allowing history to remain exactly what it has always been: patient, durable, and unconcerned with being impressive. A structure that asks only slowness. Kailasa does not request belief, and this may be its most disarming quality. It does not ask visitors to agree with a theory, adopt a worldview, or feel a prescribed sense of awe. It does not advertise mystery or demand reverence. It remains present as stone arranged through endurance, offering itself without explanation and without urgency. In a world increasingly shaped by insistence, this quiet refusal to persuade feels almost radical. The structure does not insist on wonder because it does not need it. Wonder arrives only when attention slows enough to notice repetition rather than spectacle. Kailasa was not created through a single inspired act, nor through a moment of brilliance that could be pointed to and admired. Its achievement lies elsewhere, in consistency sustained long enough for form to emerge naturally. The work was repeated, not celebrated. Each strike mattered only because it followed the one before it correctly. Patience is often misunderstood as passivity, but nothing about Kailasa suggests passivity. The labor required to shape it was intense, disciplined, and demanding. What patience provided was not ease, but coherence. Time was accepted as a condition rather than an obstacle. Progress did not need to announce itself daily. It accumulated quietly, becoming visible only when enough repetition had passed to allow space to exist where stone once was. In the late-night telling, this distinction matters. The story does not build toward a climax. There is no moment when everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, understanding arrives gradually, if it arrives at all. The listener is not asked to follow an argument, but to match a tempo. Stone accepted chisels. People accepted time. The agreement between the two produced a volume that continues to slow movement long after the work has ended. There is mild humor in how little the structure cooperates with modern habits. Visitors arrive prepared to be impressed quickly. Cameras lift almost immediately. Steps move faster than surfaces were designed to receive. And yet the space responds by doing nothing at all. It does not speed up. It does not sharpen itself for attention. It simply waits, confident that impatience will exhaust itself before the stone does. Kailasa's refusal to hurry is not a lesson delivered verbally. It is environmental. The scale resists quick comprehension. The proportions encourage shorter steps. The weight of the space lowers voices naturally without instruction. This is not design aimed at control, but at accommodation. The structure does not demand slowness. It makes speed feel unnecessary. This quality is often overlooked because it does not translate easily into description. Slowness does not photograph well. It cannot be summarized efficiently. It must be experienced, and even then, only partially. The structure allows each person to arrive at their own pace, knowing most will leave before understanding has fully settled. This does not diminish the work. It reinforces its independence from reception. Kailasa's consistency extends beyond its construction into its continued presence. It has endured changing uses, shifting interpretations, and fluctuating attention without altering its behavior. The stone does not adapt to narratives imposed upon it. It does not improve itself for relevance. It remains confident that endurance does not require participation in contemporary conversations. In this way, the structure feels less like a message and more like a condition. It does not communicate content. It establishes tempo. Those who slow down find themselves aligning with it almost unconsciously. Those who do not pass through unchanged, carrying images rather than experience. Both outcomes are acceptable to the stone. There is something quietly unsettling about this indifference. We are accustomed to objects responding to us, reflecting our presence, validating our attention. Kailasa does none of these things. It neither rewards nor punishes engagement. It remains neutral. This neutrality shifts responsibility back to the visitor. Meaning is not delivered. It is negotiated through pace. The repetition that created Kailasa did not seek recognition, it sought completion. Once complete, the work stopped. There was no need to explain it further. The stone was allowed to speak in its own language, which happens to be very slow. Time became the final collaborator, smoothing edges, adjusting textures, and continuing the work in increments too small to measure individually. If this story accompanies sleep, the remaining gift is not information, but rhythm. The listener is not expected to remember details or conclusions. What remains is a sense of tempo, carried gently into rest, the idea that some things become meaningful only when effort steps aside, that patience can be productive without being loud, that repetition, when accepted, can transform even the most resistant material into space. Kailasa does not insist that its story be learned. It does not require retention. It is content to exist as an example of what happens when people and material agree on time rather than attempt to overcome it. The structure stands as evidence that scale does not need drama and achievement does not need acceleration. In late-night history, this is where the narrative naturally softens. There is no final revelation to deliver, no mystery to resolve. The structure has already offered what it offers best: a slowing of movement, a lowering of voice, a recalibration of expectation. The listener is invited to carry this tempo forward, away from the stone, into rest. Stone accepted chisels without complaint. People accepted time without protest. Together, they produced a space where urgency feels out of place. That space remains unchanged by interpretation, unconcerned with belief, waiting without impatience. As sleep approaches, the story does not end so much as it settles. Thoughts follow the same pattern as the work that shaped the stone. Repetition replaces effort. Attention loosens, tempo slows. The structure asks nothing more. And in that restraint, something rare is preserved. Not information, not spectacle, but pace. A pace slow enough for rest to arrive on its own, without instruction, without pressure, and without needing to be remembered afterward at all. When the tools are silent. Night settles easily here, not because it is invited, but because nothing remains to resist it. The sound of tools ended centuries ago, yet their rhythm persists quietly, embedded in the way steps descend, in the way walls receive shadow without protest, in the way the air itself seems to slow, as if remembering how long it once waited. Silence does not arrive suddenly. It resumes a role it has practiced for a very long time. The chisels are gone. The hands that guided them are gone as well. What remains is not their effort, but their pace. The stone still holds the tempo of work done carefully enough that it never needed to hurry. Each surface carries the memory of repetition without preserving the noise that created it. This is not nostalgia. It is continuity without commentary, which is often mistaken for emptiness by those accustomed to explanation. There is gentle humor in how final this quiet feels. Modern endings prefer emphasis, summary, or a concluding lesson stated clearly enough to be remembered. This place offers none of that. It does not wrap itself up. It does not underline meaning. It simply becomes quieter, confident that silence is sufficient when nothing is left unfinished. The tools did their work. They were set down. Nothing else was required. If rest arrives now, let it follow that rhythm rather than interrupt it. There is no need to search for significance. Significance has already settled into the stone and does not respond well to being questioned repeatedly. The monument does not care whether it is understood tonight. It has waited longer than understanding usually lasts. The night does not dramatize its arrival. Shadows lengthen, temperatures soften, dust resettles where it belongs. The space does not announce closure, because closure would suggest a boundary that was never part of the design. Instead, the environment returns to equilibrium, the state it occupies most comfortably. Quiet resumes as the default, not as an ending. Late-night history does not demand reflection, it allows it. Thought loosens its grip, details fade without being lost. What matters remains present even as attention drifts. The work that shaped this place never asked to be remembered vividly. It asked only to be done correctly, one movement after another, until movement itself was no longer needed. Listen if listening feels natural. Not for echoes, not for voices, not for instruction. Listen for the absence of urgency. Listen for the way the space breathes when nothing interrupts it. This is not a message being delivered. It is a condition being restored. Then sleep, if sleep arrives. Let it arrive the same way the night did, without announcement, without argument, without a final thought needing to be secured. The tools are silent. The stone remains. The rhythm continues, unconcerned with whether anyone is awake to notice it.